All right. Good evening, everyone. Всем привет. Thank you for tuning in to this presentation on American football. My name is Mike Crowley. There should be some slides up in front of you. I'm sitting here at home, like I hope all of you are. I understand this is a really difficult time for all of us to be trapped inside. So hopefully, by talking about sports that usually take us outside, we can try to live a little bit of the glory that will wait for us when this is all over. Today, we're going to take a break from coronavirus, talk about American football. Here on this first slide, there's some of my favorite pictures from a game that was played just a few months ago in February. Um, Before we get into the presentation itself, I want to show you a few of these pictures. Because this is my favorite team, the Kansas City Chiefs, winning the Super Bowl back in February. So there in the top left, you have our quarterback, one of the most important players on an American football team, number 15. His name is Patrick Mahomes. He was the league most valuable player, the MVP in 2018. He was not the league's most valuable player in this past season, but he was the Super Bowl most valuable player, which is a separate award. There in the lower left is a picture of the team celebrating when it was clear they were going to win. There at the bottom is not the stadium where the Super Bowl was played, but the Chiefs' home stadium, where I've watched most of the Chiefs games that I've been to. So with that said, let's go to the next slide. We'll get started with the presentation itself. First, I'd like to tell you who I am, why I chose football as this presentation's topic, and a little bit more about my favorite team and why they're my favorite team. So myself, again, Mike Crowley. This is my second tour as a U.S. diplomat. I'm working as a staff assistant to our newly arrived ambassador, John Sullivan. My first tour was in Kiev, Ukraine, where I worked in the economic section. So I'm very excited to be here. I have a wife and two little girls. They're both, because our last tour was in a Russian-speaking country, everybody speaks at least a little bit of Russian. Both of our little girls speak it pretty well. We're just really excited to be here. Hopefully, this coronavirus crisis will pass soon and we'll be able to get out and use our Russian and see more of what your country has to offer. We're really excited about that. Why did I choose football? There's a few reasons. I love to both watch and play football. It's one of my favorite sports. It's a sport of athleticism, strategy, and of course teamwork, because it's a team sport. It is also the most popular sport in America. Now, I know that might be surprising to some of you who think that baseball, of course, is the most American sport. It's America's pastime. But in fact, if you look at the numbers, the number of viewers, the number of fans, the revenue, the amount that teams and these companies earn, football is by and large America's favorite sport. And why the Chiefs in particular? Why do I root for them? Well, the easy answer is they're my hometown team. I'm from Kansas City. It's the team that I've always rooted for as long as I can remember. So again, like I said, I'm really happy to do this presentation right now this year because it was just, feels like yesterday, but it was actually a couple of months ago already that the team did something they haven't done in 50 years, longer than I've been alive, and that was to win the Super Bowl. The Chiefs have only played in the Super Bowl 3 times, once in the very first Super Bowl when they lost, once in Super Bowl 4 where they won, and then this past Super Bowl, Super Bowl 54. So to watch them get to that championship game and win was a real thrill for me. So if we could go to the next slide, please. This slide is just a little bit about Kansas City, because most people outside of the United States probably haven't heard a lot about it. It's an interesting city because it's one of the few cities that I know of that actually exists in 2 different states. There is Kansas City, Missouri, and there's Kansas City, Kansas. So Kansas City itself is situated right on the border of those 2 states, right in the middle of the country. There's a separate mayor, a separate government for both Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri. When most people talk about Kansas City, they actually are probably talking about Kansas City, Missouri, because that's the larger of the 2 cities. That's where the downtown is. That's where the sports teams are. That's where most of what people think of as Kansas City actually exists, even though Kansas City has Kansas in its name. I went to school, I worked in both states. I went to high school in Kansas. I went to school in Missouri. I lived and worked in Missouri. As far as I'm concerned, Kansas City is one city, even though it exists as 2 separate cities. The reason this is important is because the people who support the team, the Kansas City Chiefs, they're not just the people who live on the Missouri side. It's both states. There actually used to be 2 Missouri football teams, one in Kansas City and one in St. Louis on the opposite side of the state. That other St. Louis football team was the St. Louis Rams, but they left and went to Los Angeles a few years ago. So now most Missouri are Chiefs fans, and most people in Kansas are Chiefs fans. There's actually a pretty good following of Chiefs fans throughout the Midwest. A lot of people talk about Kansas City, they call it a flyover city. That's because people who live on the coasts don't really view it as a tourism destination. There's not any famous landmarks there to go see, according to most people. But I disagree. Kansas City is not a flyover city. It's a place you should absolutely go visit if you ever visit the United States. As you can see on this slide, it's found in downtown Kansas City. There's a beautiful performing arts center that's pretty new. I think it went up probably about 10 years ago. There's Kauffman Stadium where the Kansas City Royals play baseball, and then Arrowhead Stadium where the Chiefs play football. So Kansas City, there is a World War I memorial. There is great barbecue, some of the best in the world. There's a great history of jazz, and there's a lot of sporting things you can do in the downtown area where there's a college basketball experience, and there's a lot of fun stuff to do. So again, if you're going to go to the U.S., I highly recommend checking out the heartland of our country and visiting Kansas City. But on to football. Let's go to the next slide, please. Just a few quick words about the background of football. It was actually created way back in 1869 by some college students. It's a variation of rugby. There is both a variation of American and Canadian football. Like I said, American football is even more popular than baseball, and I say that because if you look at the Super Bowl, which is the championship of the National Football League, the premier league for playing football in the United States, it's the most watched sporting event in America every year. Like baseball, football is played by both men and women. Yes, that's surprising to some, but women do play of all ages. Typically, children and adults like myself who are not professional football players play a variation of football called flag football. The main difference is that instead of tackling a player to the ground to end a play, you pull a flag from their waist, and that acts as if a tackle was made. A couple of notes here. As you look at this picture, you see a really old football there on the top. Some people know that football is referred to as pigskin. Talk about playing the game of pigskin. Football itself is a pigskin. Funny point of trivia: footballs were never actually made out of a pig's skin. When they were invented, they were made out of a pig bladder that was inflated and used as a ball. But now, modern day football, they are inflated balls. They're kind of that oblong shape, very recognizable. You can see equipment has come a long way. People used to wear kind of these soft helmets, and now there's obviously a lot of technology that goes into designing pads to protect the players because it is a very violent sport and there are routinely injuries. But I know the league has made it a priority to look into player safety and find ways to make the game a lot safer for them. So if we go to the next slide, please. To start off by talking about some of the basic rules, I want to highlight this is going to be basic rules. The NFL rulebook, there are penalties for just about anything that violates the rule that I'm not going to try to explain away from this presentation with a basic understanding. If you go watch Super Bowl 54, and there was a link on the first page because the first page of this presentation, because the NFL has put that up on YouTube for anyone to watch. So if you want to go watch my team, the Kansas City Chiefs, beat the San Francisco 49ers in Super Bowl 54 after this presentation, I want you to kind of understand what's happening. There will be points where you'll wonder, what does that yellow flag on the field mean? What are they doing? I think that will become more clear. But the main goal of this is a conversation with someone about the game of football. So let's start with the field. What does it look like? There's a picture of it there, a diagram. It's 100 yards long. 100 yards is about 91 meters. And then at each end of the field are another 10 yards of what's called the end zone. And think of the end zone as the goal for each team. Each team wants to get the ball into the other team's end zone. And at the back of each end zone, right in the center of the field, at the back of the end zone, is what's called an upright, a goalpost with two uprights on it. That is where teams will sometimes try to kick the ball. We'll talk about that more in a few minutes. But if you look at this diagram of the field, you'll see there's a lot of lines, a lot of small dots, a lot of numbers, a lot of information there. But that's all it really is. It's information. The most important parts of the field are the white sideline edges on either end of the field, and then those two end zones at either end. The end zones because that's where the scoring happens, and then the sidelines because that's where the field of play is. That's where you can take the ball. Anything inside that during a play doesn't matter at all. There's no restriction on where players can go. That's really to help everybody keep track of the game and know how much farther you have to go until you reach the end zone. I think that's everything I wanted to cover here. So if we could go to the next slide. Oh, one thing on the game clock real quick. It is a timed game. The game lasts for 4 15-minute quarters, and they divide those up into 2 halves. So you have your first quarter, second quarter, halftime. Second half begins with the third quarter, and then finally the fourth quarter. Runs during most of the activity on the field. There are some special situations which are too complicated to talk about where the clock stops, and actually managing that game clock becomes part of the sport itself. I think we're on the slide now that says team composition. So this slide alone, looking at it, probably gives you a headache, wondering what all these positions are and how you could ever understand this. You don't have to enjoy the sport of football. The things you need to know are that there are 11 players per side on the field at any given time. So on the field during a play, there are 22 players. There are 11 on the offense and 11 on the defense. I've got a note here that most teams, and this is at the professional level, every team, but most teams throughout every level have offense, defense, and then what's called special teams. Special teams only comes out onto the field for a few points in the game, but they're very important points. A kickoff, receiving a kickoff, punting the ball. We'll talk about these in a few minutes, but just keep that in mind. The official NFL roster, the number of players that can be on a team but not on the field at a time, I think the slide says 54. It's actually 55. It was just increased from 53. I thought it was increased to 54, but it was actually increased to 55 players. That includes the backup. Especially at the professional level, players are very specialized. So when you start out playing what's called popcorn or pee-wee football, your very introductory level of football for little kids, players are probably, but as you grow up, get older, you specialize. You back because you throw the ball really well. You become a lineman because you're big and strong and you have endurance. You become a receiver because you're fast and you can catch. You become maybe a defensive back because you're fast and you can't catch. There are various kind of physical profiles and characteristics that make up each position on the field. That kind of leads people to assume that you can only be effective at a position if you fit that profile, but that has been proven to be not true. We've seen that some quarterbacks, even though they're not as tall as your stereotypical quarterback is supposed to be, if they're a little shorter, they can still throw the ball very well, even if they can't see over the linebackers' heads or the line. So I just put that there to give you an idea of the number of different types of players that can be on the field at any time. Aside from some very basic rules about the number of people at the beginning of a play where the ball is, teams have a lot of flexibility. And this will become more apparent in a few minutes, but you don't necessarily have to line up in these formations on every single play, and the defense can line up however they want to line up. Typically, there's going to be a few players that are on the line of scrimmage, and that's where the ball is placed after play. Typically, the line of scrimmage is where the previous attempt reached the ball to. Sometimes that changes if there's a penalty. But there's the line of scrimmage, and then the defense on one side protecting their end zone, and the offense on the other trying to get the ball as far as they can. Okay, let's go to the next slide. What's the goal of this sport? Obviously, it's to score points, and it's to score more points than the other team. So I've got on here 4 ways to score points. Touchdowns, which are worth 6 points. And a touchdown is scored when a player on the offense, sometimes the defense, but typically on the offense, carries the football inside the other team's end zone. So think about it this way. If your goal is to get the ball all the way to the other end of the field, if you can carry it in, run it in there, or catch it in there, that's a touchdown. That's worth the most points in the game. The PAT is called a point after touchdown. Typically, you can go for 1 or go for 2. If you want 1 point, you can try to kick the ball from the 15-yard line through the goalposts at the other end. So it's only about a 33-yard attempt. I think the success rate is probably 85% or higher, but it's almost considered a guaranteed point. So a lot of people who watch the sport will think, oh, a touchdown is 7 points. A touchdown is actually 6, but they're adding in that 1 point attempt, which most teams make and most teams successfully earn on any given touchdown. The other option, though, is to go for, and in this case, the ball will be placed at the 2-yard line, and the offensive team has one more chance to get the ball into the end zone. They can run it in, they can throw it in, they can't kick it. They have to throw it or run it and make that 2 points. Now that's not guaranteed at all. Now those 2 points are riskier, and that's why that 2-yard play is riskier, and that's why you get 2 points instead of 1. Field goals. Field goals are usually made instead of a touchdown. So if you can't get the ball all the way into the end zone where you want to get it, but you think you can kick it from through the uprights on the goalpost, you can get 3 points. You can line up and do that from anywhere on the field. Most teams need to be within probably about the 45 that attempt. A safety is a complicated play, and it's for the defense. So very well, and they've got the offense all the way back by the offense's own end zone, the opposite end of the field, and they're able to tackle an offensive player inside their own end zone, then that's a safety. It gets 2 points, and they get the ball back. So that's not a very common play, and it's not a very common way to score points, but I wanted to mention it because sometimes you will see that happen. So you're probably wondering now, like, if we could go to the next slide. What is this about moving the ball? What is this about getting down the field? How is this different from rugby or soccer? The difference is this. Each team, when they get the ball, they have 4 chances to move that ball 10 yards. And there's a few different ways they can do that. They can pass. You see here passing plays, the forward pass. They can run. And then if that doesn't work, then they have special teams that can move the ball in different ways. These little diagrams over here on the right are what a lot of plays look like, especially like flag football leagues when you maybe only have 7 or 8 players instead of a full 11. You'll have a few people who will try to run down the field and catch the ball, and then there's usually somebody who's behind the quarterback who might take the ball and try to run it. But then what you don't see here are the defensive players on the other side who are going to try to tackle them and stop any given play is when a defensive player tackles an offensive player or when an offensive player goes out of bounds. So, if they have the ball. So if the offensive ball carrier goes out of bounds, that'll stop the play. Or if they're tackled to the ground, that'll stop the play. But unlike in rugby or in soccer, that doesn't mean that the ball immediately goes back to the other team. Again, they've got 4 chances to get 10 yards. So why? This is some important terminology you need to learn. What are downs? Because downs are everything in football. Typically, you'll hear 1st and 10, 2nd and 5, 3rd and 3, 1st and 15. That's somebody telling you what down it is, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, or 4th, and then how many yards the offense has to go. Now, if you start from the 25-yard line and it's 1st and 10, and your first play gains you 5 yards, then good job, it's 2nd and 5. If you gain and you get a new set of downs, a new set of attempts, a new set of tries. So, for example, if you're at 1st and 10 from the 25-yard line and your play is a really good one and it gets you to the 40-yard line, you've gone farther than you needed to go. You've gone 15 yards. So it's 1st and 10 again, but this time ultimately your goal is to get to the end zone. But you can do that by stringing together a number of attempts. But as long as you don't reach that 4th down, you can keep going. Now, what happens when you get to 4th down? Then the team has a decision to make, because on 4th down, it's your last try. If you don't make it how many ever yards you need to go, so if it's 4th and 5, if you don't make 5 yards, the other team gets the ball wherever you had it last. So if you're 4th and 5 from your own 30, that would give the other team the ball back with a very short field in front of them. It would be very easy to score a point. They could immediately kick a field goal, or more likely, they'll take a few attempts and see if they can score a touchdown. But it leaves the other team in scoring position. So most teams aren't going to do that. They're going to do what's called a punt. A punt is a special teams play. It's a special formation. The kicker will take the ball and basically drop kick it as far as he or she can. The goal is to gain field position, to put the other team as far back as possible. The team that's receiving the ball has the option to run it, to just let the ball drop wherever it goes, or to catch it and stand right where they are, not get tackled, but to just do what's called a fair catch. So there's a few different options there. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but I want you to understand that that's an option, a strategic decision that every team has to make in the course of a game is whether to go for it on fourth down. That's something you'll hear a lot. So when you're looking at how the game is played, 1st and 10 is the kind of the baseline. That's where every team starts when they get the ball. If you can get to 3rd and 2, what we would call a 3rd and short, a short yardage situation, you're in pretty good shape. But those first few attempts, 1, 2, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd down, those are the most important plays because most teams on 4th down are probably going to punt the ball to protect their field position. If we could go to the next slide. Like I said at the beginning, this is definitely a game of strategy. Every game is completely different, and everything can factor into a game, whether that's the weather, the crowd noise, even the coin toss at the very beginning. The coin toss at the beginning of the game gives the team that wins an option to either receive the ball or choose which end of the field they want to defend. Now, that's going to switch in the second half. So whichever team received the ball in the first half usually usually has to kick off in the second half. So both teams will get a full half in which they've had the possession of the ball first and in which they've defended different ends of the field. Actually, each quarter they'll defend different ends of the field, and that's because things like the wind, if the wind is blowing a certain way on the field, if the sun is high in the sky on a certain end of the field, that could affect how well an offense can move or how well a defense can defend the ball. Just a couple of factors here. A couple of notes. The highest combined score in an NFL game, 72-41. That sounds more like a basketball score. There have been 5 games in the NFL history with a score of 2-0, which sounds more like a soccer score or a football score for our Russian listeners. And that's only achieved because, like I mentioned earlier, the defense on one team was able to score a safety and keep the other team from scoring any points at all. When it comes to strategy, some teams rely really heavily on a running game where they hand the ball to what's called a running back on almost every play and let that player just charge through all the defenders and rely on kind of brute strength to win. Other teams rely heavily on a passing attack where they have very fast receivers or tight ends and a quarterback who's very accurate. That's basically how the Chiefs were able to succeed this year, along with a defense that came very strong in the second half of the season and in the Super Bowl. Other teams rely more on a balanced approach, but every method of winning has been proven successful. I could point to a Super Bowl champion from any particular year and say this team won based on their defense, this team won based on a very good passing attack, this team relied on the run game. But every approach has been successful. There's a saying among commentators and some fans that defense wins championships. I will say that at least in the Chiefs' case this year, they did not have the best defense in the league. They had a very good defense, but it was really their offense that saved the day and won the game for them in the fourth quarter. If we go to the next slide, it should be a slide about football and American culture. In some parts of the country, football really is almost a religion. People in particular talk about Texas, Georgia as places where people almost worship football. Maybe not necessarily football itself, but the people who play football. There are universities where football coaches are the highest paid individual working in that university, including the president, including all of the professors who work there, the researchers. And that's because football can make a lot of money for these universities. The fans come, they buy tickets, they buy concessions, there's advertising. There's a lot of money to be made in football, and that happens at the high school level, the college level, and of course the professional level. High school football games, they're usually played on Friday nights. Some of you might have heard about the movie Friday Night Lights. It's a movie about, I think it was a book originally, a movie about high school football culture in America. College games are usually played on Saturdays. I'm not a big college football fan. I enjoy watching it every now and then, but it's neither of the schools that I went to for undergrad or for law school had football teams, so I didn't really grow up in that same kind of culture. Professional games are played on Sundays. There are also games on Monday night. Monday Night Football is kind of a cultural event. It's a primetime game. There's a lot of advertising money that goes into it. There's a lot of production that goes into it. And then there's also some Thursday night football games as well. And then there's fantasy football and betting on the outcomes of games. Those are both very popular in America. If you go to Las Vegas, you can bet on the outcomes of the entire season. You could go right now, or after the travel restrictions are lifted for all of us. You could go to Las Vegas and place a bet that the Kansas City Chiefs would repeat as the Super Bowl champions, and you'd be able to make that bet. Somebody would give you odds on that. Fantasy football, you're probably familiar with fantasy soccer, or it's where you do kind of a pretend draft. You choose players from any different team, and then each week you get kind of a numerical score based on how those players performed in their own game that week. And then the teams with the most scores win each week. So it's really there's a lot of American culture that goes into this. If you go to the next slide, a few other things in terms of culture to talk about. The professional season, the one that I spend most of my time watching, is typically from about September to February. But you take into account there's also the draft every year, there's training camp, there's preseason games. People right now are already talking about this year's draft, organized team activities, things that the teams can start doing to prepare for the next season, even though the season officially ended just a couple of months ago in February. So really, there's something you can do all year round to enjoy the sport of football. The Super Bowl itself, it's more than just the championship game. Some people, I swear, they will watch the Super Bowl because they actually want to watch the commercials, which is almost the exact opposite of how everybody watches TV in America. Everybody watches TV and wants to fast forward through the commercials until the Super Bowl comes around, and then they want to watch the commercials themselves. And then during the Super Bowl, there's actually a huge concert. It's the halftime show. It's played right there on the field. You can see a kind of a picture of it there. It is a full production event. This year, I think it was Jennifer Lopez and Shakira. Typically, I don't watch the Super Bowl halftime show or commercials. I watch the game itself, and I use the commercials and the halftime show to get a new beer, to get some chips, to get ready to watch the next part of the game. Scholarships are worth mentioning. A lot of high school football players will get scholarships to go on to play at a college of their choice. So for those who are really physically very talented at the sport of football, which I am not, they have an opportunity to continue playing in front of huge crowds. Some of these college football stadiums will fit 70 or 80,000 people, and they are rewarded with a free education for doing that. I wanted to talk about video games. That's one way I can actually play football and be pretty decent at it. You could play every year. There's a new Madden that comes out, Madden NFL. There's kind of a funny NFL Madden curse that used to be talked about. What that used to mean was if you were on the cover of Madden for that year, there was a very high likelihood you were going to end up with some sort of career or season-ending injury, or that something bad would happen to you or your team. The curse has largely been debunked. It's gone away, as you can see there. My new favorite player, Patrick Mahomes, who led my team to the Super Bowl victory, he was on the cover of this year's Madden NFL, and it worked out pretty well for him. And then there are a lot of movies that talk about football and American culture. And on this next slide, if we could go to that, please, I picked a few of my favorites. One thing that's interesting about American football movies in particular is they tend to follow underdog stories. And these are 4 examples in which that's really the case. Rudy is the quintessential football underdog story. If you can find a way to stream this now, it would be great watching during a quarantine because it's a very uplifting story. It's about a college player named Rudy Rudiger who wanted to play for Notre Dame football. They're called the Fighting Irish. It's a kind of a legendary sports team. Um, he was not very good. He wasn't very big, but he was very persistent. He tried very hard. He worked very hard. He ultimately worked his way onto the team kind of as a support role. And then in their final game, he was able to actually get on the field and play. And at the end of the game, he was carried off the field on the shoulders of his teammates. The movie is based on a true story. Rudy Rudiger was a real person. Of course, all of these movies take kind of artistic license with the truth, and they make it more dramatic than it actually was. But it's a great movie. Friday Night Lights is one I mentioned earlier about that Friday night football sports culture in high schools. Remember the Titans is also a great movie. There's also a lot of artistic license taken with that one, but it's based on a true story of integrating football teams in the United States. I actually lived not too far from T.C. Williams High School in Arlington, Virginia, which is the team that the Titans are playing for T.C. Williams High School. And then a really good story, Invincible. Mark Wahlberg plays a character who tried out the Philadelphia Eagles, who won the Super Bowl just a couple of years ago. They held open tryouts, I think, back in the 70s, and he was just a regular guy who went to try out and made the team. So again, those are some good underdog stories. You can learn a lot about football just by watching, but there are dozens more football movies that you can look up. And like I mentioned before, look up Super Bowl 54. You can go on YouTube, you can go on NFL.com, and you can watch the entire game without commercials. It's about 2 hours long. You might be a little confused as you watch and try to get a sense for what all these yellow flags on the field mean. The yellow flags are when one of the officials, one of the referees or umpires, sees a rule violation. He'll throw the yellow flag, and then he'll explain what the violation was and what the result is. And usually the result is that one team either gains or loses 5, 10, or 15 yards, or that the ball is placed at a new position. But typically the play continues on. It's not like in soccer where a team might get a free kick. It's not like other sports where you might lose points. Typically, the ball just changes its position a little bit. But again, I highly recommend the Super Bowl. It was kind of what I would consider an instant classic, and I don't think just because I am a biased fan. My team was losing for a good portion of the second half. Things looked pretty dire, and then kind of like an underdog story, a comeback victory in the fourth quarter. We went from 20-10 losing to 31-20 winning. So a very exciting game, a lot of fun to watch, great players. Patrick Mahomes is going to be the face of the National Football League, probably for many years to come, I hope. And I will undoubtedly be watching when this next season starts up. So I've been talking for about half an hour now. You're probably sick of hearing my voice, and I've probably spoken too quickly and glossed over too many roles, and you're probably very confused. So I'd like to open it up to you guys for questions. I don't know if we have any in already. Not yet. All right, we'll give it a few minutes. I guess just talk a little bit more about what football means to me. I've been to a lot of professional games as a fan. If we were to go back to that first slide that shows Arrowhead Stadium, I've been everywhere from the very top of the stadium, kind of the nosebleed seats, where the tickets are cheap, but you can't hardly see anything on the field, all the way down to the very first row. My wife bought me tickets as a Christmas present one year, and I got to sit down right behind my team and watch them almost from the field itself. Every time I go back to Kansas City, I love to go to a game. I was able to go just this past December to the final home game of this past season. Fortunately, it was a victory. We beat one of our division rivals, the Chargers. I saw a question just came in. Tell you about tailgating. I am uniquely qualified to tell you about tailgating because that is a very time-honored tradition in Kansas City. Typically, the stadium. I wish I had a picture to show you of the what the sports complex looks like in Kansas City, because both Kauffman Stadium, where they play baseball, and Arrowhead Stadium, where they play football, are on the same piece of land, and they share a massive, massive parking lot. And the parking lot opens very, very early in the morning. In fact, some people are able to camp out the night before. People in Kansas City will start barbecuing. They will start drinking. And there's a great sense of community. People will wear, I wish I had my Patrick Mahomes jersey here to show you. Unfortunately, it is somewhere in Belgium because my HHE, my household shipment, did not get here before coronavirus struck. But people will be decked out in their game day apparel. People will throw footballs. They'll play little games, beanbag toss, cornhole, things like that. These are some kind of just American tailgating activities. But really, at the heart of tailgating is food and drinking and being with your fellow fans ahead of the game. So in Kansas City, there's a lot of barbecue because, like I said before, Kansas City is known for its barbecue. People will grill it themselves, which is what I did last year with some friends. I'm sorry, last December with some friends. We went probably 3 hours early, which gives you just enough time to heat up the grill, cook some sausages, some bratwurst, have a sandwich, have a couple of beers, and then walk into the stadium. Tailgating, it's nice because everybody is there to cheer on their team, but even though there are opposing fans, they're welcome there too. It's a good, in most places. In some places, maybe the atmosphere is not so welcoming, but in Kansas City, it was. I saw we had a second question come in, but it disappeared from my screen. So let me give just 1 second and see if I can get it back. There we go. So 2 questions. How do Americans relate to John Madden? And what is the most nail-biting American football match I've seen in my life? Okay, so first question, how do they relate to John Madden? So John Madden was a very popular, I don't know about popular, very famous sportscaster. I think he was kind of polarizing because some people viewed his what's called color commentary, the people who watch and just talk while you're watching a game. They're the commentators who just kind of try to make the game more interesting to watch by adding kind of their own soundtrack. He would say kind of some very obvious things like, well, I think the team that's going to win is going to be the one that scores the most points. And so there's some kind of Maddenisms like that, things that John Madden would say that he's kind of known for that maybe were a little frustrating for some people. Aside from that, I don't know that there's anything particularly good or bad to say about John Madden, but his video games are a lot of fun to play. As for the second question, the most nail biting, that's tough. This most recent Super Bowl was definitely starting to get there, but it's actually probably the first game on the Chiefs' road to the championship this season. We were down 20, I think it was 24-0 against the Houston Texans early in the first half. And I was watching the game with a friend of mine, Chris Rindo, who I served with in Kiev. We were both back in Washington, D.C., watching this game together. And we both started to get really nervous because a 24-0 lead early in a game is not a good thing. It's not very easy to come back from. But our team, under the leadership of Patrick Mahomes and some of our other players, he led the team to a comeback victory. In fact, by the end of that first half, the Chiefs were already tied up, and they quickly took a lead that they never let go of, and they ended up winning that game convincingly. But that first quarter was definitely nail-biting. There's also a heartbreaking loss from a few years ago against the Colts, where my team, the Chiefs, were on the other end of that situation. They had a comfortable lead that they slowly gave up over the course of the game, and by the end, they had lost, and that cut short our playoff run that season. But that's one of the great things about sports is if you watch long enough, you have a lot of memories like that of games where you thought things were going great and then suddenly they weren't, or you thought things were going terribly and then suddenly they were great. This last Super Bowl, I never gave up faith. I knew that with such a talented quarterback and such a talented team, we had every chance to win that game. I remember jumping up and down. I was watching my oldest daughter, who was about 3.5 at the time, and let me tell you, keeping a child that old up until about 11 o'clock at night to watch a sporting event is probably not the best thing, but she got to share in that moment with me when I was jumping up and down about the change in score as my team began winning. So there's a lot of great moments like that in sports. There was another question that came in. Again, I'm trying to pull it up here, but it was about the reputation that some fans might have How are they characterized? I want to find the exact question. Here we go. Do fans of American football have some sort of a reputation? For example, soccer fans are thought to be violent and rugby fans very polite. I would say that depends a lot on the particular fan base. Because of the concept of tailgating that we talked about a little bit ago, some football fans might have a reputation for being kind of drunk and rowdy, but I don't think that's really the case. Typically, people are there to have a good time, and I mean that in the best sense of the word. Uh, they are not going, in most cases, to go out and riot after losing. They're not going to get into fights in the parking lot, although that does happen. But if you take into account the number of people who watch any particular game, I'm talking, 60, 70,000 people who are watching these in a stadium. Um, I think those cases are pretty rare. Generally, I would say most football fans are committed, but committed to their team. They want their team to win, but they're also tolerant of other teams' fans. Any given stadium, including my own, will have a good mix of hometown fans and fans who have traveled from wherever the other team is from. Maybe these people have paid thousands of dollars to come travel from their home to see their team play, and so most fans don't want to ruin that because they know at the end of the day, it really is just a game. People might take it seriously and they might be diehard fans, but I think everybody views it through the same lens of it's sports. It's supposed to bring us together, even if we have rivalries. For example, our ambassador, John Sullivan, he's a huge Patriots fan. My team was very fortunate not to play the Patriots in this offseason because the Patriots lost early on. The Patriots beat us last year on their road to the Super Bowl. Um, it's not a rivalry, but most people these days are kind of sick of the Patriots winning because they've had so much success over these past 20 years. But despite the fact that Ambassador Sullivan cheers for the Patriots, he's still a great guy and he's still a great ambassador. So it's little rivalries like that will not get into most people's the way that they treat each other. I'm looking to see if we have any other questions up. Yeah, there's a little bit of a lag. Here's a question. As a football fan, are you concerned about the disturbing link between football and head trauma that has been widely discussed in the media recently? This is a great question. There has definitely been a link um, shown in some studies and discussed widely in the media. I think there was even a movie. I think it was called Concussion. It had Will Smith as starring a doctor who helped uncover some of the evidence of CTE, which is this brain injury that a lot of players who have particularly violent concussions over the course of their career may suffer from. There's been some tragic cases. In fact, there was one in Kansas City. A man named Javon Belcher was a player for the Chiefs. He was involved in a domestic violence incident and then took his own life outside the practice facility in front of our coach at the time. And that really brought to light for a lot of people, I think, there can be a disturbing link between um, the effects that violent sport like this can have on players. It's not an easy question to answer, but it's one that I know the league is the National Football League. They're looking into better ways to protect the players, and I could talk about some rule changes that have been made over the last couple of years. We talked about the kickoff. The kickoff is typically one of the most dangerous plays in the sport because the teams are lined up so far apart from each other, or at least they used to be, and they could really get up to full speed, charging each other from across the field and then just crashing into each other as hard as they could. The league has taken steps to change that. They've changed how far apart the teams line up. I think now they only line up 10 yards apart. The ball is placed further down the field, which makes what's called a touchback more likely to happen. That's when the ball is kicked out of the back of the end zone. And when that happens, there aren't these collisions that you used to see. I know that helmet technology has come a long way. There are also more penalties these days to protect the players. So roughing the quarterback, targeting a defenseless receiver, These are penalties that I didn't want to get into because they're very difficult to explain, but they were either put into the game to help protect the players, or the league placed greater emphasis on these to protect the players. I've often wondered if I had, you know, two little boys instead of two little girls, would I want them to play football? Or if my little girls decide they want to play football when they get to that age, how do I feel about that? Um, and I think that's a decision that I would have to make at the time, because the technology and the research is changing so much these days, and I know that the will is there to make it safer for players to play the sport. But it is a great question, and a lot of people talk about how violent the sport is, not just from head injuries, but also just the physical toll it takes on players' bodies. That's one of the reasons these players are compensated so high, is because this sport really does take a toll on them. Um, there was a new agreement between the players' union and the league reached just this year that extended the playing season. Previously, it was 16 games. Now it's going to be 17 games. And every additional game, when you're playing against, other professional athletes who are at the top of their game, it can really have its effect on a player. Certainly, if I were getting hit by a 200 pound, 250-pound linebacker on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, I wouldn't be able to do that for more than a game. So obviously, I'm not a professional athlete. These players are, um, but still, it does have an impact. I saw another question just came in. Tell us more about women in American football. Is there a women's football league? I've heard there's one famous female coach, and she's the only female coach in the U.S. What do fans think about it? So my initial answer would be, I think most fans don't think about it. Most fans just want to watch football, but I think most fans do want there to be equality. If the best player is a woman, then that should be the player on the field. If the best coach is a woman, that should be the coach. I think things are moving in the right direction. I know we've recently started having more women referees, umpires in the sport, officials, the ones who are on the field, making sure the players are following the rules. There was, I believe, one of the coaches, not the head coach, but one of the assistant coaches for the 49ers in this year's Super Bowl. She was a woman, and I think it's becoming more prevalent throughout the league. I think it's also one of those things that takes a long time for the professional league to catch up with where the kind of the high school, college, the feeder system is. It's going to take a long time, not a long time, but to reach that level. Once you start making kind of those I'm not going to say accommodations, because that's not what they need, but they need to make sure that there is equality at every level of the sport. And I think that's true for both players and for coaches. For players, it's a more difficult question because, like every sport, um, men and women have different, um, typically different leagues. There's a lot of different issues that go into that. So just like there's a different, you know, women's professional soccer team or professional basketball team, you would think that there would be a women's professional football team. So far, that's not the case. I think typically when women have made it onto professional football team, college football teams, a lot of times it's as a kicker, which is a position that maybe isn't as famous or important to a lot of fans. But that's a trend that I personally am happy to see, and hopefully that will continue. There was another question that just came in. Which is the most famous football team in the United States? So there are probably three answers to give you, maybe four. Some people, our ambassador included, would say the New England Patriots are the most famous. They've certainly had the most success over the last 10 to 20 years. The second answer would be the Dallas Cowboys. They are called America's team by many. There are fans. There are fans for every team everywhere in the United States and all across the world. The Cowboys had a period of success, I think, mostly in the 90s, that a lot of people became huge fans of. We talk about bandwagon fans a lot, people who become a fan of a team when they're doing very well. So that's another potential answer. The Green Bay Packers are one of the first teams. They were in Super Bowl I with the Kansas City Chiefs. They're another very famous team that a lot of people might know of. I'm trying to think of what the fourth answer I thought would maybe work for this. But yeah, I'd say those are three very famous teams. A lot of teams in the National Football League will sometimes move cities. For example, I mentioned the St. Louis Rams became the Los Angeles Rams. The Oakland Raiders became the Las Vegas Raiders. Teams move around sometimes, but there's kind of a set of core teams that have never gone anywhere. And I think typically those are the ones people would say are the kind of the most well recognized. There was another question, if I could bring it up again. Can I teach you some idioms or phrases or sayings that are commonly used in everyday speech that are derived from American football? That's a good question. If I had thought about this in advance, I would probably have some ready for you. Um, Sports is one of those things that a lot of people will just kind of mix it into their everyday language, and so that's a great question. That's something um, it probably does come up more than comes to mind right now. Um, Typically, gosh, how about I pull out my iPad here and I'll do a quick search and just see what comes up. Okay. Yeah, here's a couple of good ones. To move the goalposts. I mentioned the goalposts are those the uprights at the end of the field that team needs to kick the ball through to score points. When we talk about somebody moving the goalposts, that means they have changed kind of the goal of something. So it would be like moving the goalposts from the back of the end zone to the 10-yard line while you're in the middle of a game. It's really kind of changing what the goal of something is in the middle of it. Um, I think some of these are kind of obvious, but maybe they're obvious to me because I'm a native speaker. Um, to to score an own goal, I think that applies just as equally to soccer or to football as you know it. Um, to be on the ball, to know what's going on. Literally in football, being on the ball means on the ball where it is on the field. There's a few situations where that might be important. If the ball is loose, if a player knocks it free and it's a live ball. The first player to jump on it and to gain possession of it is the team that player's team is going to get the ball. Um, the ball is placed between every play at a certain spot on the field, typically where it ended the last play, and the teams line up on the ball. So the line of scrimmage is where the ball is itself. Um, Getting the ball rolling to start something off. Um, Yeah, and then just a game plan. Every team typically goes into a game plan. Our coach, Andy Reid, formerly the coach of the Philadelphia Eagles, probably a future Hall of Fame coach. He goes into every game. My understanding is with 10 to 15 plays that he knows he's going to call at the start of the game, and typically has a good idea how the game is going to play out, and that's a game plan, just a plan for something in your life. I saw maybe one more question, or maybe it was just a comment. Thank you. Really interesting webinar. I've learned something new today, but have to read the rules again. Thank you. Yeah, reading the rules is it's quite a feat. Like I said, it's 92 pages. I hopefully didn't make any misstatements today, but it's a lot to keep up on. The rules change every year. Typically, they don't make major changes; they make minor ones. But if the main thing you come from is an understanding of what it means to play 4 downs, how you get 4 attempts to move the ball 10 yards, and every time you reach that 10-yard goal, you get a new set of 4 downs. That's really the basis of the game right there. Everything else comes from that. There are a lot of nuances, a lot of different considerations that go into every particular play. But that's one of the things that I really like about football is that it's played play by play. When I watch basketball or soccer, I know that there are plays happening on the field, but I don't see them developing the same way I can see them when I watch football. And that's because at the beginning of a football play, the players are all lined up, they're standing in one spot or they're crouched in one position, and there's going to be anywhere from 3 to 15 seconds of action where all the players are going to do something to try to move the ball down the field or to stop the other team from doing that. So it's really easy to watch the game chunk by chunk develop, but it very quickly becomes a game of inches. That's what people in America call it, even though it's a game of yards. and going 100 yards, it comes down to moving the ball sometimes just a few inches is enough to get you a new set of downs, to give you another 4 chances to get a touchdown or to get the next down. So there's really a lot of strategy, and it's a lot of fun to watch. I'm seeing some more thank yous coming in. So I think that's all we've got for today. Thank you very much for attending. I hope this was interesting. The American Center is doing a lot more of these. My wife is going to do one, I think, Thursday night on sewing your own face mask or face covering for going out and about during this coronavirus crisis. Again, thank you for attending. I look forward to doing these more in the future.